Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. The one defining element about the Syria conflict has been the lack of access by traditional media outlets. As a result, we've had to rely on so-called citizen journalists to provide us with images and reports as to what is happening on the ground. But the lack of context means the reporting is far from being nuanced. And that is something that Irish journalist Starr is all too familiar with. He spent 5 years living inside Syria and only left the country back in February. And he's written a book about what he saw. It's aptly entitled Revolt in Syria, Eyewitness to the Uprising. Starr joins me today from Dublin. Stephen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
First of all, I want to ask you, how did you end up in Syria and what at the end of the day made you leave?
I studied security, international security and conflict studies here in Dublin, and I kind of was always interested in the Middle East and the conflicts that tend to happen in that part of the world. And kind of as a university graduate, there are very few kind of opportunities for people who are interested in that field in Ireland, I guess, and in the UK. And decided basically to travel to the Middle East. The Israeli Hezbollah war of 2006 had happened the previous year, and that was was in the news and so on. So it captured my attention, I guess, at the time, and for that reason, I found myself in Syria.
And what at the end of the day, though, made you leave?
In early February of this year, I visited an area in eastern Damascus called Sakwa, and it had recently been recaptured by the regime from rebels, kind of, I guess, a day or two before I got there. And we had to pass kind of several checkpoints in and out to get there. And we saw some pretty kind of harrowing stuff in this neighbourhood. And I reported what I had seen there. And obviously you have to come back out of checkpoints as well. I went there with a number of foreign journalists who left Syria the following day on a flight back to London. I was still in the country and was, I had to go on with my daily life there, only a couple of kilometres from where I'd seen these horrible things. And, it was very difficult to kind of continue kind of living with that kind of growing paranoia and so on. Because, I didn't know who knew that I had been to this area. And I didn't know who knew what I was reporting and where my articles were being printed and so on. So, it was a growing paranoia, I guess, by February that kind of forced me to leave, I guess.
You've talked about, in your writing, about those who fear what lies ahead once Assad is gone. And it's not just the minorities, is it, but the emerging middle class who are very worried about what the landscape is going to look like.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people had done very well in the years leading up to the revolution. I think about 13 private banks had been established around the country, which provided easy credit and loans to people who wanted to buy cars or houses or get married and so on. So this kind of growing kind of middle class, especially in the main cities of Damascus and Aleppo, who were quite comfortable with what they had. They could holiday kind of once a year in Turkey. They were able to buy cars. Their kids were in stable schools and that. They didn't want much change at all. Relatively kind of apolitical people. And, something people told me quite a lot was that you can write about anything you want, but don't touch politics or religion. These make up a large percentage of people in these two major cities. And, I'm not even talking about minorities who have their own cases for concern. So, it's at the moment, I think in Syria, it's very much divided. And I think people who sided with the regime at the beginning haven't changed their position. And the same goes for kind of people who oppose the regime.
Do you have,
Stephen, the space for dialogue?
Stephen, do you have any idea about the percentage of the population who still support Assad? Are they in the minority or the majority?
We have no idea. It's very difficult to say. Obviously, the more areas that the regime bombs and shells, and the more people the regime kills, the less support it has. For example, if the government arrests and beats and tortures, let's say one person in Damascus, or let's say anywhere in the country, overnight you have maybe 40 or 50 people who have turned against the regime as a result of this one individual being tortured by the regime. When you see peaceful protesters being gunned down in the streets, for every one person, they have extended families and friends and so on. And when they see that their friend or whoever it is has been killed by the regime, they're instantly going to oppose the government and what it's doing.
Stephen, you talked about in a piece aptly entitled "The Fog of War" for Foreign Policy website about a town where you've been based, where there was a mixture of Christians and Sunnis and Alawites, and how that sort of mixture of views and opinions is not being reflected in the reporting, is it?
Yeah, and I guess it's reflective of other areas of the country too. But I think it's important to be clear that the Christian community that I knew in that town certainly very much supported the government, and they would ask each other questions whether, if a new government came to power, would they control the churches and would they control what their women wore and so on. A lot of Alawi people would drive around in these large Mercedes with blacked out windows and pictures of the president on them. So it was very kind of obvious, who you could see as being pro-regime and that, and it was very obvious where they lived and that. But as I wrote in the Foreign Policy article, for at least more than once there were protests in this town that were allowed to take place. And I saw myself where the security cars drive past the protesters within a couple of feet and didn't do anything. Now, since I wrote the article, things have changed a little bit in that town. The Free Army, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, RPG'd the main police station in the town centre. And I think 5 policemen were killed at the time. And last week there were some kind of massacre. I think 48 people were killed in the town, and we're led to believe that the regime is responsible for this. We don't really know who is responsible. It's likely that the regime was responsible, but we can't be sure because there are no reporters in the town. And, it's so difficult to get free access to that town and many others around the country.
Stephen, the government seems determined to fight to the bitter end. What do you think will be the tipping point?
It's very difficult to say. There's supposedly been a number of turning points going right back to the end of last year. In February this year, we thought Bab al-Amr in Homs was going to be a tipping point when rebels took control of that area. They were pushed out after a month. Now we're talking about Aleppo being a tipping point. It seems that the regime is very slowly but surely regaining control of that city too. A wave of defections. Last week we had the Prime Minister defecting, and now it's been confirmed he's in Jordan. These are all so-called turning points and tipping points. But the regime is still hanging on. It's still militarily quite sound, I guess. There have been defections, but it seems it hasn't affected their own military operations at all. The protest will prevail simply because so many people are being killed. And you can't force an entire population to do exactly what the regime wants it to do. And millions of people have lost this fear factor that had been in place for decades, and they simply want the regime out. So, the protest movement will prevail. How bloody things get and how many people die, we don't know. How long will it last before the regime actually does fall? We can only guess. But, I think certainly the more bloody the regime becomes, the quicker it's going to happen.
And Stephen, given the fragmented nature of Syrian society that you've written about, do you see, with the inevitable collapse of Assad and his government, that minorities might try and form breakaway republics?
It's difficult to say. No one really knows. It's possible. We've already seen thousands of Alawi people returning to their villages in the western part of the country along the coast. They're afraid of living in Damascus and Aleppo. And some people I know have been kind of commented on for their accents, saying that, that you're a regime lackey and so on, and get out of my shop. That incident took place in Damascus quite a while back. when I was still in the country. And it's happening all over the country that people are afraid and they're leaving. But also the regime is arming these Alawi communities and telling them to be afraid and telling them that, that there are Islamist gangs coming for them. So it has contributed enormously to this sense of insecurity. And that, I don't think Christians are going to pick up guns and try and fight for the regime. They like the regime and it's convenient for them. But I think it's another thing to actually pick up guns and fight for the government. Particularly when the regime falls. It can be very difficult to assess what exactly they're fighting for. It's certainly possible that Iran and Hezbollah could arm the Shabiha or regime gangs, and they could, wreak havoc across the country for a very long time. But, I think Syrians have a strong kind of identity that they're Syrian first and foremost. I think they see the regime as being a mafia that has been in power for only 40 years. A lot of people, particularly activists, say to me that, Syria was a country before the Assads came to power. Syria was a country for a very long time before that, and that Syria will continue to be a united country after the regime falls. So, I think it's the longer the regime stays in power, the increased likelihood of that. But I think generally speaking that there isn't a serious fear of that happening.
Stephen Starr, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, and that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.